Billionaire was taking his fiancée to a Christmas lunch until he saw his ex at a bus stop with twins. Welcome to Secrets Narrated. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Secrets Narrated so you don't miss the next one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. The gleaming black Bentley cut through the busy Chicago streets as Calvin Monroe adjusted his platinum cufflinks for the third time. At 43, he commanded billion-dollar logistics deals with the same precision he applied to his perfectly pressed navy suit and meticulously styled dark hair. Today, however, something felt different. Wrong, even. "You're nervous," Brielle Stanton observed from the passenger seat, her voice carrying that smooth confidence that had first attracted him 6 months ago. At 34, she was everything a man of his status should want: elegant, sophisticated, and refreshingly uncomplicated. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her cream-colored cashmere coat, and her emerald engagement ring caught the winter sunlight streaming through the window. Calvin forced a smile. Just want everything to go smoothly today. The engagement had happened fast. Too fast, if he was being honest. 3 weeks ago, at a charity gala, surrounded by cameras and expectant faces, he'd dropped to one knee with a ring he'd bought that same afternoon. The applause had been thunderous, the photographs perfect for the society pages, everything his family had been pushing him toward for years. "Your mother called this morning," Brielle continued, scrolling through her phone with manicured fingers. "She wanted to make sure I knew about the family traditions. Something about your grandmother's Christmas pudding recipe?" Calvin nodded absently, his attention divided between the conversation and the weight of expectation pressing down on his chest. The Monroe family Christmas lunch was sacred, a gathering of Chicago's old money elite where business deals were discussed over champagne and marriages were evaluated like stock portfolios. Today would be Brielle's first appearance as his official fiancée, her introduction to a world where everything had its place and everyone knew their role. "She also mentioned that your cousin David will be there with his new wife," Brielle added with a slight edge to her voice. "The one who's pregnant with their second child." There it was, the subtle pressure he'd grown to expect. At 43, Calvin was considered the family's most eligible bachelor turned cautionary tale. His success in business was undeniable. Monroe Logistics had revolutionized supply chain management across 3 continents, but his personal life remained a source of family concern and endless speculation. Traffic slowed as they approached the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Oak Street. Calvin's hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories threatened to surface. Memories he'd spent 2 years carefully burying beneath work, travel, and now this engagement. "Tell me again about your brother's company," Brielle said, clearly trying to fill the silence that had settled between them. "The one in San Francisco?" Calvin began explaining Marcus's tech startup, grateful for the distraction, when the light ahead turned red. The Bentley came to a smooth stop, joining the line of holiday traffic that crawled through downtown Chicago on Christmas Eve. That's when he saw her. At first, it was just a glimpse of red fabric at the bus stop to his right, a woman in a crimson wool coat, standing with her back to the street. But something about her posture, the way she held her shoulders, made his breath catch in his throat. She turned slightly, adjusting something in her arms, and Calvin's world tilted off its axis. Elara Quinn. 2 years hadn't changed her. The same rich brown hair now pulled back in an elegant bun that revealed the graceful line of her neck. The same porcelain skin that had felt like silk beneath his fingers. The same quiet strength in her bearing that had drawn him to her like a magnet. But she wasn't alone. In her arms she held 2 small children, babies, really, dressed in matching yellow coats with tiny knitted hats. Twins. Even from this distance, Calvin could see they were identical, their chubby faces pink from the December cold as Elara carefully adjusted their blankets. The mathematics hit him like a physical blow. 2 years since their breakup. The children looked to be around a year and a half old. The timing was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. "Calvin?" Brielle's voice seemed to come from very far away. The lights green, but Calvin couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding 30 feet away. Elara was struggling slightly with the weight of both children, trying to check the bus schedule posted at the stop while keeping them warm. She looked tired but determined, her movements careful and practiced. A mother. She had become a mother. One of the children, A little girl with wispy dark hair reached up and touched Ilara's face with a tiny mittened hand. Ilara smiled, and Calvin felt that familiar flutter in his chest that he thought he'd successfully buried. It was the same smile she'd given him on quiet Sunday mornings, the same gentle warmth that had made him feel, for those stolen moments, like he could be a better man than he actually was. Calvin, Brielle's voice was sharper now, tinged with irritation. The cars behind us are honking. He forced himself to look away, to put the car in drive, to move forward like a functioning human being. But even as they continued toward his family's estate in Lincoln Park, even as Brielle launched into a story about her morning at the spa, Calvin's mind remained fixed on that bus stop. Those children, those beautiful, perfect children who had his dark hair and his mother's nose and Ilara's delicate chin, his daughters. The realization hit him with devastating clarity, just as they pulled into the circular driveway of the Monroe family mansion, where his future was waiting to be celebrated, and his past had finally caught up with him. What had he done? Calvin's hands trembled as he handed his keys to the valet, the familiar weight of his Patek Philippe watch suddenly feeling like shackles around his wrist. The Monroe estate loomed before them, its Georgian columns wrapped in elegant evergreen garlands, warm light spilling from every window, like a scene from a Christmas card. "Oh my God, Calvin," Brielle breathed beside him, her emerald eyes wide as she took in the sprawling mansion. "It's even more beautiful than the photos." He managed a nod, though his mind remained trapped at that bus stop. Those tiny faces, those dark eyes that mirrored his own. The way Ilara had looked so natural, so complete, holding them both like she'd been born to be their mother. "Remember what we discussed?" Brielle whispered as they approached the front door, her arm sliding through his with practiced ease. "I'm nervous about meeting your grandmother. You said she can be particular." Calvin forced himself to focus. "Just be yourself. She'll love you." The lie came easily, though nothing felt easy anymore. Through the tall windows, he could see his family moving about the main reception room, his mother Margaret directing the staff with military precision, his father Harrison holding court near the fireplace, cousins and aunts scattered throughout like pieces on a chessboard he'd been playing his entire life. The heavy oak door opened before they could knock, revealing James, the family's longtime butler. "Master Calvin, welcome home, and this must be Miss Stanton." "Please call me Brielle," she said with that radiant smile that had graced the covers of lifestyle magazines. As they entered the marble foyer, Calvin caught sight of himself in the antique mirror hanging near the staircase. He looked exactly as he always did, immaculate, composed, successful, but behind his hazel eyes he could see the cracks beginning to form. "Calvin, darling," his mother's voice rang out as she swept toward them in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and holiday cheer. Margaret Monroe, at 68, was still a formidable force of nature, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her red St. John suit chosen specifically to complement the Christmas decorations. "Mother," Calvin said, accepting her embrace while his chest continued to constrict. "You remember Brielle?" "Of course, my dear, you look absolutely stunning." Margaret took Brielle's hands in hers, studying her with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating potential additions to the family tree. "That coat is gorgeous. Hermes? Burberry, actually," Brielle replied with just the right amount of modesty. "Calvin has excellent taste in Christmas gifts." Calvin barely registered the exchange. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for one heart-stopping moment, he wondered if it could be Ilara, if she had somehow seen him at the red light, if she was calling to, "Son?" His father's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Harrison Monroe approached with 2 glasses of champagne, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier light. At 71, he still commanded every room he entered, a trait Calvin had inherited along with the family business empire. "Dad," Calvin accepted the champagne, grateful for something to do with his hands. "We need to discuss the Singapore expansion over dinner," Harrison said, then turned his attention to Brielle with practiced charm. "But first, welcome to the family, my dear. Calvin's told us wonderful things about you." More lies. Calvin had told them almost nothing, mainly because there wasn't much to tell. Their relationship had been built on convenience and timing rather than the earth-shattering connection he'd once shared with Uncle Calvin. 8-year-old Sophie, his cousin David's daughter from his first marriage, came barreling across the room in a red velvet dress, her dark curls bouncing. She wrapped her arms around his waist with the enthusiastic affection of childhood. "Hey, Soph," he said, his voice catching slightly. She looked so much like the little girls he'd seen at the bus stop, the same dark hair, the same bright eyes full of life and possibility. "Is this your new wife?" Sophie asked, looking up at Brielle with unabashed curiosity. "Fiancée," Calvin corrected gently. "This is Brielle." "You're really pretty," Sophie announced with the brutal honesty of children. "Are you going to have babies with Uncle Calvin? Because Daddy says he's getting too old to be just dating people." The champagne glass slipped from Calvin's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal and golden liquid. The room fell silent. "Calvin," Margaret gasped, while James appeared instantly with a dustpan and broom. "I'm sorry," Calvin said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. My hand slipped." Brielle was beside him in an instant, her hand on his arm, her face a mask of concern. "Are you feeling all right? You've been quiet since we left the apartment." 20 pairs of eyes were now focused on him, Monroe family members who had gathered to celebrate his engagement, to welcome his chosen bride into their carefully constructed world. They were all watching, waiting for him to explain his sudden clumsiness, his obvious distraction. But how could he tell them that at this very moment, somewhere across the city, his real family was probably boarding a bus? How could he explain that everything he'd built, this relationship, this perfect life, this carefully orchestrated future, was based on a lie he'd been telling himself for 2 years? "Perhaps we should sit down," his grandmother Victoria suggested from her position in the wingback chair by the fireplace. At 93, she remained the family's unofficial matriarch, her pale blue eyes missing nothing. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Calvin." She had no idea how accurate that assessment was. "I'm fine," he said. But even as he spoke the words, Calvin felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. Just tired from the drive. But as Brielle guided him toward the sitting area, as his family resumed their holiday conversations, as the afternoon stretched ahead of him like a beautiful prison, Calvin couldn't stop thinking about yellow winter coats and matching knitted hats. Somewhere in Chicago, his daughters were learning to walk, to talk, to exist in a world where their father was nothing more than a stranger who had abandoned them before they were even born. And here he was playing the part of the perfect fiancé, the successful son, the man who had finally gotten his life together. The irony was suffocating. Lunch was served in the formal dining room, where the Monroe family had hosted Christmas for over 40 years. Crystal stemware caught the light from the massive chandelier, and burgundy roses from Margaret's prized greenhouse adorned the mahogany table that seated 20 with ease. Calvin found himself positioned between Brielle and his cousin David, whose pregnant wife Emma chatted animatedly about nursery preparations. Every word about baby names and midnight feedings felt like another nail in his chest. "We're thinking Theodore for a boy," Emma said, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "It's been in David's family for generations." "That's beautiful," Brielle replied with genuine warmth. "Family traditions are so important." Calvin stabbed at his roasted duck, the rich flavors turning to ash in his mouth. Across the table, his 16-year-old niece Chloe was scrolling through her phone beneath the tablecloth, occasionally rolling her eyes at the adult conversation. "Calvin," his father's voice cut through his dark thoughts. "I was just telling Senator Williams about the new shipping routes through Southeast Asia. He's interested in discussing infrastructure partnerships." The senator, a distinguished man with graying temples, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Your logistics network is impressive, Monroe. We could use innovative minds like yours on the Transportation Committee." "Thank you, Senator," Calvin managed. Though his mind kept drifting to yellow coats and tiny faces, "I'd be happy to discuss it further." Brielle squeezed his thigh under the table, her smile bright as she launched into a story about her recent charity work with children's hospitals. She was perfect, Calvin realized with growing dread. Absolutely perfect for this world, for this family, for the man everyone expected him to be. But as she spoke about visiting sick children, all he could think about was the children he'd never visited, never held, never even acknowledged existed. "Earth to Uncle Calvin." Chloe's voice snapped him back to the present. She was looking at him with the piercing intelligence that ran in the Monroe bloodline. "Dad asked you a question." David was indeed staring at him expectantly. "I asked if you and Brielle have started thinking about a wedding date. Emma's hoping it'll be before the baby comes so she can still fit in her bridesmaid dress." The table erupted in gentle laughter, the kind of warm family humor that had once comforted Calvin but now felt suffocating. "We're thinking spring," Brielle said smoothly, covering for his silence. "Maybe a destination wedding. Calvin's been working so hard lately." "Spring weddings are lovely," Margaret chimed in. "Though June has always been traditional for the Monroe family. Calvin's grandmother Victoria set down her wine glass with deliberate precision, her pale blue eyes, still sharp despite her age, fixed on Calvin with an intensity that made him squirm. "You seem distracted today, dear," she said quietly, though her words carried across the table. "Is everything all right?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Victoria Monroe had an uncanny ability to see through facades, to sense when someone at her table was harboring secrets. It was a skill that had served her well during 45 years as the wife of a federal judge. "Just business pressures," Calvin replied, forcing what he hoped was a convincing smile. "The fourth quarter numbers are boring," Sophie interrupted, having been strategically placed at the children's end of the table. "Can we talk about something fun? Like Uncle Calvin's babies?" Emma laughed. "Sophie, sweetie, they're not married yet. Babies come after the wedding." "But they could have babies now," Sophie insisted with the stubborn logic of childhood. "My friend Madison's mom had her before her parents got married. Madison says it made their family extra special because love came first." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Calvin felt his blood pressure spike as every adult at the table processed the innocent comment. In the Monroe family, certain traditions were sacred. Certain orders were expected to be followed. David cleared his throat. "Sophie, that's not really appropriate dinner conversation. It's perfectly natural curiosity." Dr. Rebecca Chen, David's sister-in-law and a pediatrician, interjected diplomatically. "Children understand love differently than adults. They don't see it as complicated." Calvin's fork clattered against his plate. That name, Chen. It was too close to the name he'd forbidden himself to think about. Too close to the memories he'd buried under layers of work and denial, and this engagement to a woman who deserved so much better than his fractured heart. "Actually," Chloe said, never one to let an uncomfortable moment pass, "I think Uncle Calvin would be a great dad. He always remembers our birthdays and he's not weird around kids like some old guys." "I'm 43, not ancient," Calvin protested weakly. "That's practically retirement age," Chloe shot back with teenage brutality. Harrison laughed. "Your uncle's got plenty of good years left. Don't write him off yet." But as the conversation swirled around him, Calvin felt like he was drowning in plain sight. These people loved him, had supported him, had welcomed Brielle with open arms because they wanted him to be happy. They had no idea that 2 years ago, he'd walked away from the very thing they were all encouraging him toward. His phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't resist checking it under the table. But it was just a work email about quarterly projections, meaningless numbers that had once been the center of his universe. What if Alara needed help? What if those beautiful little girls were cold, hungry, struggling while he sat in this palace pretending to be someone he wasn't? "Calvin?" Brielle's voice was gentle but concerned. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm sorry," he said, looking around the table at all the expectant faces. "I think I might be coming down with something." It wasn't entirely a lie. He was coming down with something. The crushing realization that he'd made the worst mistake of his life, and now it might be too late to fix it. "Perhaps you should rest after lunch," Margaret suggested, maternal concern creeping into her voice. "We can't have you getting sick right before New Year's." As the meal continued around him, Calvin made a decision that would change everything. He had to find Alara. He had to see those children up close, to know for certain what his heart was already screaming at him. He had to finally face the truth he'd been running from for 2 years, even if it destroyed everything he'd built in the process. Calvin excused himself from dessert, claiming he needed fresh air for his headache. The lie came easier than it should have, sliding off his tongue like all the other deceptions he'd been telling himself for 2 years. "I'll come with you," Brielle offered, starting to rise from her chair. "No, please," he said quickly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Stay and enjoy the coffee. My grandmother has been looking forward to getting to know you better." It was true. Victoria Monroe had been studying Brielle with the focused attention of someone evaluating a potential heir to the family legacy. The older woman's approval would mean everything for their relationship's acceptance into the Monroe fold, if their relationship even survived what Calvin was about to do. The winter air hit him like a slap as he stepped onto the estate's wraparound porch. Snow had begun falling in earnest, dusting the manicured gardens and making the world look clean and new. But Calvin felt anything but clean as he pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. He still had Alara's number. He'd never deleted it, though he'd told himself 100 times that he should. Late at night, when the penthouse felt too quiet and success tasted too hollow, he'd sometimes stare at her contact information like it was a prayer he didn't know how to say. The phone rang once, twice, On the third ring, her voice filled his ear. Hello? She sounded exactly the same. Warm, cautious, with that slight rasp that appeared when she was tired. Calvin's throat closed completely. Hello? Is anyone there? Ilara. Her name came out like a confession. It's Calvin. The silence that followed was deafening. He could hear background noise, children's laughter, what sounded like cartoons playing on television, the ordinary sounds of a life being lived without him. What do you want? Her voice had gone cold, professional. The same tone she'd used during their final fight when he'd accused her of trying to trap him with a pregnancy he'd refused to believe was real. I saw you today, he said, gripping the porch railing so hard his knuckles went white. At the bus stop on Michigan Avenue. Another silence, then, I don't know what you're talking about. But he could hear it in her voice, the slight catch that meant she was lying. She had seen him. She knew exactly what this call was about. The twins, Ilara. I saw them. The line went so quiet he thought she'd hung up. Then he heard her breathing, quick and shallow, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed world had just been shaken to its foundation. I have to go, she whispered. Please don't hang up, I need to. The dial tone cut through his words like a blade. Calvin stood there in the falling snow, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. Around him, the Monroe estate glowed with warm light and holiday cheer, but all he could think about was the fear he'd heard in Ilara's voice. She was afraid of him. The woman who had once trusted him with her deepest secrets, who had curled against his chest on Sunday mornings and talked about dreams they might build together, was now afraid of a simple phone call. What kind of man had he become? Through the dining room windows he could see his family still gathered around the table. Brielle was laughing at something Harrison had said, her face animated and beautiful in the candlelight. Margaret was refilling wine glasses while David and Emma discussed baby names. Normal people living normal lives, making normal plans for normal futures. Calvin pulled up his contacts again, scrolling until he found another number he'd kept but never called. Marcus, his business partner's son, was 26 and worked in digital media. More importantly, he had access to databases that could find anyone. Calvin? Dude, what's up? Isn't today your big family Christmas thing? I need a favor, Calvin said without preamble. I need you to find someone's address. Whoa, okay. This sounds serious. You're not going all stalker ex-boyfriend on someone, are you? The words hit too close to home. It's complicated. It always is. What's the name? Ilara Quinn. She's 32, probably still in Chicago. He swallowed hard. She has children, twins. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Calvin, man, this sounds like something you should maybe talk to a lawyer about first, or a therapist, or literally anyone who's not me helping you find some woman's home address. She won't talk to me. I tried calling. I just need to see. Calvin stopped himself before he could say, my daughters. I need to apologize for something that happened a long time ago. Look, I get it. But showing up at someone's house uninvited is like restraining order territory. Maybe try flowers, or a letter, or giving her some space to decide if she wants to talk to you. But Calvin wasn't listening anymore. Through the window, he could see Chloe holding baby Emma while David took photos. The scene was so perfect, so full of family joy that it made his chest ache with loss. Somewhere across the city, his own daughters were spending Christmas without him, without even knowing he existed. Forget it, he told Marcus. You're right. This was a stupid idea. He ended the call and stood there in the snow, feeling more alone than he had in his entire life. Behind him, the Monroe family continued their celebration, his place at the table growing cold. He thought about Ilara's voice on the phone, the way she'd said his name like it hurt. He thought about those tiny faces at the bus stop, innocent and perfect, and completely unaware that their father was a coward who had abandoned them before they were born. Calvin Monroe was one of the most powerful men in Chicago. He could move mountains with a phone call, could make million-dollar deals with a handshake, could have anything he wanted delivered to his door within hours, but he couldn't undo the worst decision of his life, and he was beginning to realize that all the money in the world couldn't fix what he had broken when he'd walked away from love because he'd been too proud to fight for it. The snow continued to fall, covering his footprints on the porch as if he'd never been there at all. Calvin returned to the dining room 20 minutes later, snow still dusting his shoulders and his face pale from more than just the cold. The family was gathered in the living room now, Margaret at the piano playing Christmas carols while the children sang along with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Brielle looked up from where she sat beside Victoria, her green eyes immediately catching the change in his demeanor. "You look frozen," she said, rising gracefully to meet him. "Are you feeling worse?" "Maybe a little," he admitted, which was the closest thing to truth he'd spoken all day. He felt like he was dying inside, each breath an effort. Victoria's sharp gaze followed him as he moved to the bar cart in the corner. Calvin poured himself 3 fingers of his father's 30-year-old scotch and drained half the glass in one swallow. "Calvin," Harrison's voice carried a note of concern. "That's not like you." His father was right. Calvin had always been measured, controlled, the responsible son who'd inherited the family's business acumen along with their emotional restraint. But control felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. "Just a long day," Calvin said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Sophie, ever observant, abandoned her position by the piano. "Uncle Calvin, why do you look sad?" "It's Christmas." The innocent question hit him like a physical blow. Calvin knelt down to Sophie's level, looking into her bright, curious eyes that reminded him painfully of the children he'd seen at the bus stop. "Sometimes grown-ups feel sad even on happy days," he said quietly. "It's complicated." "But why?" Sophie persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "If something makes you sad, you should fix it. That's what Daddy says." Calvin felt his composure cracking. "Some things can't be fixed, sweetheart." "That's not true," Sophie declared with absolute certainty. "Daddy fixed my dollhouse when I broke it. And Mommy fixed my friendship with Maya when we had a fight. Grown-ups can fix anything if they try hard enough." The room had gone quiet, all conversation suspended, as the adults sensed the emotional undercurrent of the exchange. Calvin could feel Brielle's concerned gaze, his mother's worried frown, his grandmother's penetrating stare. "Sometimes," Calvin said, his voice barely above a whisper, "sometimes we break things so badly that they can't be put back together." "Like Humpty Dumpty?" Sophie asked, tilting her head. Calvin's throat closed completely. "Yeah, like Humpty Dumpty." It was David who finally broke the tension, scooping Sophie up with a gentle laugh. "Come on, sunshine. Let's help Grandma with the piano. Uncle Calvin needs a few minutes to feel better." As Sophie was carried away, Calvin became aware that everyone was still watching him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man standing naked in a spotlight with nowhere to hide. His phone buzzed in his pocket. For one wild moment his heart leaped. Maybe it was Alara calling back too, but it was just a text from his assistant about Monday morning meetings. Reality crashed back down around him like a collapsing building. "Excuse me," he managed, and headed for the bathroom down the hall. Calvin locked the door and stared at himself in the mirror. He looked exactly like what he was, a man falling apart in slow motion. His usually perfect hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. His eyes were bloodshot from the scotch and something that might have been unshed tears. He pulled out his phone and did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He opened his photo gallery and scrolled back to the pictures he'd taken of Alara during their time together. Pictures he'd never deleted but had buried so deep in his phone that he'd almost forgotten they existed. There she was, laughing at something off-camera in his penthouse kitchen, flour in her hair from an ambitious baking attempt. There she was curled up on his couch reading a book, unaware he was photographing her. There she was asleep in his bed, her face peaceful and trusting in the early morning light. She had loved him, really, truly loved him with a depth that had terrified him, even as it had made him feel more alive than ever before. And he had thrown it away because his business partner had convinced him she was after his money, because admitting their relationship publicly would have complicated his image, because he had been a coward who chose the easy path over the right one. Calvin sank onto the closed toilet seat, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume he no longer knew how to wear. Through the bathroom door, he could hear his family singing Silent Night, their voices blending in perfect harmony. He thought about Alara spending Christmas alone with 2 babies. He thought about those little girls who would grow up never knowing they had a father who could give them everything except the one thing that mattered most, his presence. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Calvin?" Brielle's voice was gentle, concerned. "Can I come in?" He quickly closed the photo gallery and opened the door. Brielle stood there in her perfect cream dress, her perfect hair, her perfect makeup, looking every inch the perfect fiancée for the perfect life he'd thought he wanted. "Everyone's worried about you," she said, stepping into the small space with him, "including me. What's going on?" Calvin looked at this beautiful, kind, innocent woman who had done nothing wrong except fall for a man who was still in love with someone else. She deserved honesty. She deserved better than the lie he was living. "Brielle?" he began, then stopped. How did you tell someone you'd asked to marry you that you'd made the worst mistake of your life before you'd ever met them? Is it work? She pressed. Because if the Singapore deal is stressing you out, we can postpone the wedding planning until I have children, he said. The words hung in the bathroom air like a confession that would change everything. And it did. Brielle's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, shock, hurt, and finally a dawning understanding that made Calvin's chest ache with guilt. What did you just say? Brielle's face went completely white, the color draining from her cheeks as if someone had opened a valve. Her emerald eyes, which had sparkled with warmth just moments before, turned cold as winter glass. Children, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You have children? Calvin nodded, unable to trust his voice. The small bathroom suddenly felt like a prison, the walls closing in around them. How many? Her question was surgical in its precision. 2. Twins. They're 18 months old. Brielle's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment Calvin thought she might be sick. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady, but deadly quiet. 18 months. She was doing the math, her sharp mind calculating dates and timelines. That means they were conceived while we were dating. No, Calvin said quickly. Before I met you. Their mother and I, we broke up 2 years ago. Their mother. Brielle's laugh was bitter, hollow. You mean your ex-girlfriend who was pregnant with your children when you started pursuing me? The accusation hit like a slap. Calvin had never thought of it that way, but hearing it spoken aloud made his stomach twist with shame. He had started dating Brielle 6 months after Ilara had told him about the pregnancy. 6 months after he'd walked away from the most important moment of his life. I didn't know, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt like lies. You didn't know? Brielle's voice rose slightly, though she was clearly fighting to maintain control. How do you not know you have children, Calvin? She told me she was pregnant, but I didn't believe her. I thought. He stopped, unable to voice the ugly accusation he'd made that night, the words that had destroyed everything between them. You thought what? Brielle demanded. Calvin's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man he didn't recognize. Haunted, broken, guilty. I thought she was trying to trap me. My business partner convinced me it was a scheme to get money. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the door, they could still hear the family singing, their voices a cruel backdrop to the destruction of everything Calvin had built over the past 6 months. So you walked away, Brielle said finally. You walked away from a pregnant woman who loved you because you thought she was after your money. Yes. And then, 6 months later, you met me at that charity gala and decided I would be a suitable replacement. The clinical way she said it made Calvin flinch. It wasn't like that, wasn't it? Brielle's composure was cracking now, revealing the hurt underneath. You needed a wife to complete your perfect image, someone who wouldn't complicate your life or challenge your assumptions. Someone safe. She was right, and they both knew it. Calvin had been drawn to Brielle precisely because she was everything Ilara wasn't: uncomplicated, socially appropriate, content with the surface level of his life. I cared about you, he said weakly, but you didn't love me. It wasn't a question. You were never going to love me the way you loved her. Calvin's silence was answer enough. Brielle stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady again, the voice of a woman who had just made a decision that would change both their lives. I'm going to walk out of this bathroom, say goodbye to your family, and leave. You're going to tell them I felt sick and had to go home. Brielle, no. Her tone brooked no argument. You're going to give me this dignity, Calvin. After 6 months of being your placeholder, you owe me that much. She reached for the door handle, then paused without turning around. For what it's worth, I think you're making a mistake. Not about us. We both know this engagement was built on sand. But about your children. Whatever happened between you and their mother, they're innocent. They deserve to know their father. She won't let me near them, Calvin said desperately. She's afraid of me now. Then you'll have to prove you've changed. Brielle finally turned to look at him one last time. The question is, have you? She slipped the emerald engagement ring off her finger and placed it on the marble countertop. The sound of it hitting the stone seemed to echo through the small space like a gunshot. Goodbye, Calvin. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Calvin alone with his reflection and the weight of his choices. He picked up the ring, its faceted surface catching the light like tears he couldn't seem to shed. Through the bathroom door, he could hear Brielle's voice in the hallway, bright and composed as she made her excuses to his family. She was protecting him even now, giving him a graceful exit from the mess he'd made. 5 minutes later, he heard the front door close. Then his mother's voice, concerned and questioning. His father's deeper tones. The family discussing whether someone should check on him. Calvin sat back down on the toilet seat and stared at the engagement ring in his palm. 6 months ago, he'd thought it represented his future. Stability, respectability, the kind of love that didn't demand too much or ask uncomfortable questions. Now he saw it for what it really was. A beautiful, expensive symbol of his cowardice. His phone buzzed again. Another work email. Another reminder of the life he'd built on lies and half-truths, and the careful avoidance of anything that might make him vulnerable. But for the first time in 2 years, Calvin didn't care about quarterly projections or shipping routes or board meetings. All he could think about was yellow winter coats and tiny faces that looked like his own, and a woman he'd loved enough to destroy himself rather than risk losing her on her terms instead of his. The family's singing had stopped. Soon, someone would come looking for him. He would have to explain Brielle's sudden departure, would have to face their disappointment and confusion, but first he had to figure out how to become the man his daughters deserved him to be, even if it cost him everything else he'd worked to build. Calvin emerged from the bathroom 15 minutes later to find his family gathered in the foyer, their faces a mixture of concern and confusion. Margaret was wrapping Brielle's forgotten scarf around her hands while Harrison paced near the front door. "Where's Brielle?" David asked immediately. Emma said she left looking upset. Calvin's throat felt raw, as if he'd been screaming, though he'd spent the last quarter hour in complete silence. She went home. She wasn't feeling well. Victoria's pale blue eyes studied him with the intensity of a woman who had spent 9 decades learning to read people. "And you let her drive alone while sick?" "She insisted," Calvin said, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface of what had actually happened. "This isn't like you," Margaret said, her maternal instincts clearly in overdrive. "You've been acting strange all day. Is there something wrong with the engagement? Did you two have a fight?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Calvin looked around at these people who loved him, who had welcomed Brielle into their circle, who had been planning to celebrate his wedding in a few months. They deserved better than more lies. "We're not getting married," he said quietly. The words landed like a bomb in the elegant foyer. Emma gasped. David's eyebrows shot up. Harrison stopped pacing and turned to stare at his son. "What do you mean you're not getting married?" Margaret's voice climbed an octave. "Calvin, what happened?" Calvin sank into one of the antique chairs that lined the hallway, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years. "I told her something that changed everything." "What could you possibly have told her that—" Margaret began, then stopped as understanding dawned in her eyes. She knew her son well enough to recognize the look of a man carrying unbearable guilt. "Oh, Calvin," she whispered. "What did you do?" The question was so gentle, so full of maternal love and disappointment, that Calvin almost broke down right there. Instead, he looked up at his family, really looked at them, and made another decision that would change everything. "I have children," he said for the second time that day. The reaction was immediate and explosive. David nearly dropped his wine glass. Emma clutched her pregnant belly as if protecting her unborn child from the shock. Harrison's face went through a series of emotions before settling on something that looked like grief. It was Sophie who broke the stunned silence, having wandered back from the living room at the sound of raised voices. "Uncle Calvin has babies," she asked with delighted excitement. "Where are they? Can we meet them?" The innocent question was like a dagger to Calvin's heart. "They're not here, sweetheart." "Why not?" Sophie persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "If they're your babies, why aren't they with their daddy?" Calvin felt tears threaten for the first time that day. "Because their daddy made some very bad choices." Victoria rose from her chair with the careful dignity of her age, her cane clicking against the marble floor as she approached him. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience and loss. "Tell us everything," she said simply, and Calvin did. He told them about Ilara, how they'd met at a coffee shop near his office, how she'd been reading a book on sustainable urban planning, and he'd been inexplicably drawn to her intelligence and passion. He told them about the 3 years they'd spent together, the way she'd made him laugh, made him think, made him want to be better than he was. He told them about the pregnancy announcement, about his business partner's poisonous advice, about his own cowardice and pride. He told them about walking away from the woman he loved because he'd been too afraid to trust in something real. He told them about seeing Ilara at the bus stop today, about the twin daughters he'd never held, never acknowledged, never even believed existed until he saw their faces. When he finished, the foyer was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and Emma's quiet crying. 18 months, Margaret said finally. You've had daughters for 18 months and we never knew. I didn't know either, Calvin said miserably. I convinced myself it wasn't real. But you knew today, Harrison said, his voice harder than Calvin had heard it in years. You saw them today and you came here and sat at our table and let us toast your engagement to another woman. The accusation was fair and devastating. Calvin had no defense for it. What's the woman's name? Victoria asked quietly. The mother of my great-granddaughters. Ilara Quinn. She's an urban planner. She worked for the city until... Calvin trailed off, realizing he had no idea what had happened to Ilara's career after he'd abandoned her. Had she been able to work while pregnant with twins? Had she lost her job? Had she struggled financially while he'd been living in luxury? She's beautiful, Sophie announced, having somehow gotten hold of Calvin's phone during his confession. The screen showed one of the photos he'd been looking at earlier. Ilara laughing in his kitchen, flower in her dark hair. The family gathered around to look, and Calvin watched their faces as they saw the woman he'd thrown away. Margaret's expression softened with recognition of real love. David nodded approvingly. Even Harrison's hard expression cracked slightly. She looks kind, Emma said through her tears. And happy. She was happy with you. She was, Calvin admitted. Until I destroyed it. Victoria handed his phone back to him, her pale eyes thoughtful. What are you going to do now? It was the question Calvin had been avoiding, the one that would determine the rest of his life. He thought about Brielle's parting words, about the ring sitting on his bathroom counter, about the yellow coats and tiny faces that had haunted him all day. I'm going to find her, he said, surprised by the strength in his own voice. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to try to earn the right to know my daughters. And if she won't see you? David asked practically. You said she was afraid of you. Calvin stood up, feeling more certain than he had in 2 years. Then I'll prove to her that I've changed, however long it takes. Margaret stepped forward and cupped his face in her hands, the way she had when he was a little boy with scraped knees and bruised pride. You should have told us, she said softly. We could have helped. We could have been there for her, for the babies. I know, Calvin whispered. I know I failed everyone, but I'm going to try to make it right. Sophie tugged on his jacket. Uncle Calvin, what are your babies' names? Calvin's heart clenched as he realized he didn't know. He didn't know their names, their personalities, their favorite foods, or bedtime stories. He was a father who knew nothing about being a father. I don't know their names, Sophie, he admitted, but I'm going to find out. As his family began asking questions and making plans, because that's what the Monroes did, they fixed things and made plans, Calvin felt something shift inside his chest. The crushing weight of guilt was still there, but underneath it was something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope. Tomorrow he would begin the most important mission of his life. He would find Ilara Quinn and his daughters, and he would spend whatever time it took to prove that love, real, honest, vulnerable love, was worth fighting for, even if it meant losing everything else he thought he'd wanted. Calvin spent Christmas night in his penthouse office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the glow of multiple computer screens. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw yellow winter coats and heard Sophie's innocent question, "What are your babies' names?" By dawn, he had exhausted every legal avenue he could think of: property records, voter registrations, professional licensing databases, all either outdated or protected by privacy laws. The Ilara Quinn, who had once been listed as a city urban planner, seemed to have vanished from all official records 2 years ago. Around 7 a.m., his phone rang. Marcus. "Dude, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," the young man said without preamble. "You sounded really messed up. Are you okay?" Calvin stared out at the Chicago skyline, where early morning light was painting the buildings gold. "I need that address, Marcus, please." There was a long pause. "This is about more than an apology, isn't it? Those children are mine," Calvin said quietly. "I walked away when she was pregnant, and now I need to make it right." "Holy shit," Marcus breathed. "Calvin, man, why didn't you just say that yesterday? That changes everything. Can you help me? I'm already pulling public records. Give me an hour." Calvin used that hour to shower, change into jeans and a simple sweater, the most casual clothes he owned, and drive to a children's store in Lincoln Park. He wandered the aisles like a lost man, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of options. Stuffed animals, clothes, toys, books. How did you choose gifts for children you'd never met? In the end, he bought 2 identical teddy bears, soft and cream-colored with pink bows. Simple, classic, safe, the kind of toys that couldn't be wrong. His phone buzzed as he was leaving the store. "Got an address?" Marcus texted. "But Calvin, she doesn't own the place. Looks like she's renting a small apartment in Pilsen. And dude, the rent is only $800 a month. That's not a lot for raising twins in Chicago." The text hit Calvin like a physical blow. $800. He spent more than that on a single dinner at his favorite restaurant. While he'd been living in a penthouse worth millions, Ilara had been struggling to raise their 1.5-year-old daughters in a neighborhood that, while improving, was still far from affluent. The address led him to a converted warehouse in Pilsen, now housing affordable apartments for young professionals and families. Calvin parked his Bentley a block away, suddenly aware of how out of place the luxury vehicle looked on these streets. He climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, his heart pounding harder with each step. Apartment 3B. He could hear sounds from inside. Children's laughter, a television playing cartoons, the ordinary sounds of life being lived. Calvin raised his hand to knock, then froze. What was he going to say? "Hi, I'm the father who abandoned you and I brought teddy bears." Before he could lose his courage, the door across the hall opened. A woman in her 70s emerged, wearing a faded housecoat and carrying a bag of trash. "You looking for someone?" she asked, studying Calvin with sharp, suspicious eyes. "I'm looking for Ilara Quinn," Calvin said, "and her daughters." The woman's expression immediately hardened. "You a bill collector? Because I already told the last one that girl pays her rent on time and minds her own business." "No, I'm not." Calvin stopped, realizing how he must look. Even in casual clothes, everything about him screamed money and privilege. "I'm their father." The admission hung in the narrow hallway like smoke. The elderly woman's eyes widened, then narrowed again with something that looked like protective anger. "You're him," she said, her voice dripping with disgust. "You're the bastard who left her pregnant." Calvin felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Yes, ma'am, I made a terrible mistake and I'm trying to fix it." "Trying to fix it?" The woman stepped closer despite being barely 5 feet tall. "You think you can just show up with your fancy car and your guilty conscience and fix what you broke?" "I have to try." "Well, you're 2 days too late," she said with grim satisfaction. They moved out Tuesday, packed up that little car of hers and left. Didn't say where they were going, but I got the feeling it wasn't anywhere around here. Calvin's world tilted. Moved out? But why? Maybe because some rich boy in a fancy suit started calling and scaring her. The woman snapped. She was jumpy as a cat after Christmas Eve, kept looking out the windows, checking the locks. Whatever you said to that poor girl, you scared her good. The phone call. Calvin's desperate attempt to reach Ilara had driven her away. She'd packed up their daughters and disappeared because of him. Again. Did she say anything about where she might go? Calvin asked desperately. Family. Friends. Even if I knew, why would I tell you? The woman crossed her arms over her chest. That girl's been through enough without you showing up to mess with her life again. Calvin pulled out his business card with trembling fingers. If she comes back, if you hear from her, please give her this. Tell her I just want to talk. Tell her I know about the girls and I want to help. The woman took the card and immediately tore it in half. She doesn't need your help. She's been doing just fine without you. Please, Calvin said, his voice breaking. Those are my daughters. I need to find them. You should have thought about that 2 years ago, the woman said coldly. Now get out of here before I call the police. Calvin stood in the empty hallway as she disappeared back into her apartment, the door slamming behind her. He stared at the door to apartment 3B, imagining Ilara inside just days ago, packing their life into boxes while his daughters played around her feet. He pressed his palm against the door, as if he could somehow feel the echoes of the life that had been lived there. His family, the family he'd thrown away and now couldn't find. Calvin sank onto the top step of the staircase, still clutching the bag with the teddy bears. Around him, the building hummed with life. Children playing, televisions murmuring, the ordinary sounds of families being families. But somewhere in Chicago, or maybe not in Chicago anymore, Ilara was alone with 2 18-month-old children, afraid that the man who had already abandoned them once was coming back to hurt them again. Calvin pulled out his phone and called the one person who might be able to help him now, his grandmother. Victoria Monroe had connections in every corner of Chicago society, and she had the kind of gentle authority that could open doors that remained closed to angry, desperate men. "Grandmother," he said when she answered, "I need your help. They're gone." Then we'll find them, Victoria said simply. Come home, Calvin. We'll find them together. As Calvin walked back to his ridiculously expensive car in this neighborhood where his daughters had taken their first steps, he made himself a promise. No matter how long it took, no matter how far he had to search, no matter what it cost him, he would find Alara Quinn and their children. And this time, he wouldn't let fear drive him away from love, even if love no longer wanted him back. Victoria Monroe's sitting room had been transformed into a war room. Maps of Chicago and surrounding suburbs covered every surface, while her mahogany desk held 3 laptops operated by Marcus and 2 of his tech-savvy friends. The elderly matriarch sat in her favorite wingback chair, a crystal tumbler of brandy in one hand and her phone in the other. No luck with the hospitals, Margaret reported, hanging up her cell phone. If Alara needed medical care for the twins, she didn't use her real name. It had been 3 days since Calvin's disastrous trip to Pilsen. 3 days of the Monroe family machine working at full capacity to locate one frightened young mother and her children. Victoria had mobilized contacts across the city, former charity committee members, old family friends, anyone who might have connections to urban planning departments or children's services. Calvin sat on the Persian rug surrounded by printouts and photographs, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, which he hadn't. The teddy bears sat on the coffee table, their cheerful pink bows a stark reminder of his failure. What about her parents? David asked from his position at the window where he'd been making calls to universities where Alara might have studied. Did you ever meet her family? Calvin's laugh was bitter. She mentioned her mother lived in Portland. Father died when she was 12, but I never met any of them. I kept our relationship compartmentalized. The admission hung heavy in the room. Everyone understood what he meant. He'd hidden Alara from his world just as effectively as he'd hidden his world from hers. Wait, Marcus said suddenly, looking up from his laptop. I might have something. Alara Quinn had a college roommate named Jessica Martinez. She's still active on social media, and there are photos of her with someone who looks like your Alara from about 3 years ago. Calvin was across the room in seconds, peering over Marcus's shoulder at the laptop screen. There was Alara, younger and radiant, her arm around a petite woman with dark curls. They were at some kind of outdoor festival, both laughing at something off camera. Can you find Jessica's current information? Already on it, Marcus said, fingers flying across the keyboard. Jessica Martinez, 29, works as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial, lives in Wicker Park. Victoria set down her brandy. Margaret, call our friend Dr. Patterson at Northwestern. See if he can arrange a discreet introduction. But Calvin was already reaching for his jacket. I'm going there now. Calvin? Victoria's voice stopped him cold. You cannot simply show up at a hospital demanding to speak with someone. You'll look like a stalker. Then what do you suggest? Calvin's voice cracked with desperation. Every day that passes, they get further away. What if she's left Chicago entirely? What if she's taken them somewhere I'll never find them? Victoria studied her grandson with the same intensity she'd once reserved for reading opposing counsel during her late husband's judicial career. Then she stood, moving with surprising grace for her age. We're going together, she said simply. A grandmother looking for her great-granddaughters is far less threatening than a desperate father hunting for children he abandoned. An hour later, Calvin found himself in the Northwestern Memorial cafeteria, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he couldn't taste. Victoria sat across from him, elegant in her navy coat and pearls, looking perfectly at home in any environment. Jessica Martinez appeared exactly on time, looking curious and slightly wary. She was prettier than her photos suggested, with kind eyes and the confident bearing of someone who dealt with life-and-death situations on a daily basis. Dr. Patterson said you wanted to speak with me about a friend, Jessica said, sliding into the chair next to Victoria. He was very mysterious about the details. Victoria smiled with practiced charm. Thank you for agreeing to meet us, dear. This is my grandson, Calvin Monroe. We're looking for someone we believe you might know. Alara Quinn. Jessica's expression immediately shifted, becoming guarded. Why are you looking for Alara? Calvin leaned forward, unable to help himself. She has my daughters, I know how that sounds, but you're him, Jessica interrupted, her voice sharp with recognition. You're the asshole who got her pregnant and disappeared. The accusation hit Calvin like a physical blow, but he forced himself not to react defensively. Yes, I am. And I'm trying to make it right. Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. Make it right? Do you have any idea what you put her through? She loved you, really loved you. And when she needed you most, you accused her of lying and walked away. I know, Calvin said quietly. I know I destroyed everything, but I've seen the twins now. I know they're mine, and I want to be their father. You want to be their father? Jessica's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. Where were you when Alara was throwing up every morning for months? Where were you when she had to quit her job because she couldn't handle the stress and the pregnancy complications? Where were you when she was in labor for 14 hours with no one holding her hand? Each question was like a dagger to Calvin's chest. He thought about those months. What had he been doing while Alara was suffering alone? Probably closing deals, taking meetings, congratulating himself on dodging a bullet. Victoria reached across the table and placed her hand over Jessica's. We understand your loyalty to Alara. It speaks well of your character. But those children have a family who wants to know them, a family who could provide for them. Jessica's eyes flashed. Alara provides for them just fine. In an $800 a month apartment while raising twins? Calvin couldn't keep the question in. Jessica, I'm not trying to take them away from her. I just want to help. I want to know them. Jessica stared at him for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in her mind. Finally, she spoke. She came to my apartment Tuesday night, packed everything she owned into her Honda Civic and showed up at my door at midnight, with 2 crying babies and a story about some phone call that terrified her. Calvin's stomach dropped. Is she still there? She stayed one night, Jessica said carefully. Then she left. She said she couldn't put me at risk too. At risk of what? Victoria asked gently. Jessica's laugh was hollow. At risk of you. She's convinced that a billionaire who didn't want his children 2 years ago isn't suddenly interested in being a father. She thinks you're planning to take them away from her. The truth hit Calvin like lightning. Alara wasn't just running from him. She was running from the fear that he would use his wealth and power to steal their daughters. In her mind, he wasn't a repentant father seeking redemption. He was a threat to the only family she had left. Where did she go? Calvin asked desperately. Jessica stood up, her decision made. I don't know. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Not until you prove you've actually changed. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Calvin. For what it's worth, I hope you have changed. Those little girls deserve a father. And Alara, she deserves to be happy again. She hasn't been, not really, since you broke her heart. As Jessica walked away, Calvin felt something crumble inside his chest. He'd been thinking about this search as a mission to reclaim what was his. But Alara didn't belong to him. Those children didn't belong to him. He'd forfeited any claim to them the moment he'd chosen doubt over trust, pride over love. She's protecting them from me, he said to Victoria, the words barely audible. Victoria nodded sadly. Yes, she is. And until you understand why, you'll never find them. Calvin stared out the cafeteria windows at the Chicago skyline, where somewhere in the sprawling city or beyond, his family was hiding from the man who should have been their protector. The question was no longer how to find them. The question was how to become worthy of being found. 1 month later, Calvin sat in Dr. Sarah Chen's office, no relation to the Dr. Chen from his nightmares, staring at a tissue box he'd already emptied twice during their session. The therapist's office was deliberately calming with soft lighting and comfortable furniture, but Calvin felt like he was being flayed alive from the inside out. Tell me about the moment you walked away, Dr. Chen said gently. Not the justifications you've built up over time, the actual moment. Calvin closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that night 2 years ago. Alara's apartment had been cozy, filled with the scent of the vanilla candles she loved. She'd made dinner, something simple, pasta with the marinara sauce she'd perfected after months of experimenting. They'd been laughing about something. He couldn't remember what. Then she'd gone quiet. That particular stillness that meant she had something important to say. I need to tell you something, she'd said, her hands folded in her lap like a child confessing to breaking something precious. Calvin had known immediately. Some primitive part of his brain had recognized the signs he'd been ignoring for weeks. Her exhaustion, the way she'd been sick in the mornings, the subtle changes in her body that he'd attributed to stress. I'm pregnant, she'd whispered. And Calvin's first thought hadn't been joy or fear or even surprise. It had been, this ruins everything. I was angry, Calvin admitted to Dr. Chen, opening his eyes. Not at her, at myself, because the moment she said it, I knew I wanted it to be true. I wanted those babies. I wanted that life with her, and that terrified me more than anything I'd ever felt. Why did that terrify you? Calvin laughed bitterly. Because I'd built my entire identity around being in control. My business, my image, my relationships, everything had to fit into the perfect life I'd designed. And loving Alara the way I did, wanting a family with her, that wasn't controllable. That was messy and vulnerable and real. So you chose to believe she was lying rather than admit you were afraid. I chose to believe my business partner when he said she was after my money. I chose to believe the worst possible interpretation because it gave me an excuse to run. Calvin's voice broke. I broke her heart because I was too much of a coward to risk having mine broken first. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. And now? What's different now? Calvin thought about the past month. He'd taken a leave of absence from Monroe Logistics, something that had sent shockwaves through the company. He'd started therapy. He'd begun volunteering at a children's center in Pilsen, learning what it actually meant to care for toddlers. He'd read every book on child development he could find. Most importantly, he'd stopped looking for Alara. I realized I was doing it again, Calvin said, using my money and connections to try to control the situation, instead of actually changing myself. Alara was right to be afraid. The old Calvin would have tried to buy his way into their lives, maybe even fight her for custody. And the new Calvin? Calvin was quiet for a long moment. The new Calvin is learning to be the man they deserve, whether they ever want to know him or not. Dr. Chen smiled. The first time Calvin had seen her do so in 4 weeks of sessions. That's significant progress, Calvin. How does it feel to say that? Terrifying, Calvin admitted, but also freeing. I spent 2 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty inside. Now I'm building something real. After the session, Calvin drove to the children's center where he'd been volunteering. It was in the same neighborhood where Alara had lived, and working there felt like penance and hope combined. Today was story time, and Calvin found himself sitting cross-legged on a colorful rug, surrounded by a dozen toddlers who didn't care about his net worth or his family name. "Mr. Calvin!" 2-year-old Maya climbed into his lap with the fearless affection that only small children possessed. "Read the Bear book." Calvin opened the worn copy of Corduroy and began to read, his voice automatically dropping into the gentle tone he'd learned children responded to. As he read about the little bear looking for someone to love him, Calvin felt the familiar ache in his chest. Somewhere out there, his own daughters were this age, probably learning to love books and stories. But for the first time in months, the ache was accompanied by something else. Peace. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. Even if his daughters never knew him, he could love other people's children. He could be the kind of man who showed up, who cared, who stayed. After story time, Calvin was cleaning up toys when Maria, the center director, approached him. "Calvin, there's someone here to see you." He looked up to find Jessica Martinez standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Calvin's heart stopped. She wouldn't be here unless... "Can we talk?" Jessica asked. They walked to a nearby coffee shop in silence. Calvin's hands shook as he ordered, his mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to Alara? To the twins? Was Jessica here to tell him to stop volunteering? That even this small connection to children was too close to his daughters? "She knows," Jessica said once they were seated. "About the therapy, the volunteering, the fact that you stopped looking for her." Calvin set down his coffee cup carefully. "How?" "My cousin works here." She mentioned the billionaire volunteer who shows up every day to read to kids and change diapers and never talks about himself. Jessica's smile was small but genuine. "It took me a while to realize she was talking about you." "Is she?" Calvin couldn't finish the question. "She's safe. They're safe. She got a job with a planning firm in Madison. It's not much, but it's enough." Jessica studied Calvin's face. "She also said she's been following news about Monroe Logistics, about your leave of absence." Calvin nodded. "I needed to figure out who I was without the company, without the money defining me. And who are you?" The question hung between them like a bridge. Calvin wasn't sure he was ready to cross. He thought about the past month, about the small hands that had reached for him during story time, about the lessons he'd learned from Dr. Chen, about the man he was slowly becoming. "I'm a father who wants to earn the right to love his children," Calvin said quietly, "even if that means loving them from a distance." Jessica reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. "She wanted me to give you this. She said, if you really have changed, you'll understand what it means." Calvin's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, 2 little girls with dark curls and his mother's nose. sitting in a sandbox at what looked like a park. They were building something together, their faces bright with concentration and joy. On the back, in Alara's careful handwriting, Lily and Rose Monroe Quinn. They love books, butterflies, and making castles in the sand. They ask about their daddy sometimes. Calvin stared at the photo until his vision blurred. His daughters. Their names were Lily and Rose, and they were beautiful, and they asked about him. They wondered about the father who had walked away before they were born. "She's giving you a choice," Jessica said softly. "You can keep this photo and know that they're happy and safe, or you can prove you've really changed and maybe someday earn the right to know them." Calvin looked up from the photograph. "What would prove I've changed?" "Time," Jessica said simply. "Keep volunteering. Keep going to therapy. Keep being the man they would want their father to be. And maybe when you're ready, really ready, she'll be ready too." As Calvin walked back to his car, the photo carefully tucked in his wallet next to his heart, he realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what he wanted or what he deserved. He was thinking about what was best for Lily and Rose Monroe Quinn. And that, he thought, might be the beginning of real love, the kind of love worth waiting for, worth changing for, worth becoming worthy of, even if it took forever. 2 years later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the Madison Children's Library as Calvin finished arranging the story circle. 2 years of reading to children had taught him exactly how to create the perfect space. Cushions arranged in a semicircle, picture books displayed at toddler eye level, and enough space for little bodies to wiggle without disrupting their neighbors. He'd driven up from Chicago the night before, as he had every first Saturday of the month for the past year and a half. What had started 6 months after that devastating Christmas as a desperate pilgrimage had evolved into something different, a quiet commitment to being the man he'd promised to become, whether anyone was watching or not. "Mr. Calvin." The voice was small but clear, carrying across the children's section like music. Calvin turned and felt his heart stop. A little girl with dark curls and familiar hazel eyes was walking toward him, clutching a worn copy of Corduroy to her chest. Behind her, moving more cautiously, was her identical twin, the same curls, the same eyes, but with a more serious expression that reminded Calvin painfully of himself. "Lily?" he said softly. The little girl beamed. "Mama said you might be here. I brought my favorite book. Will you read it to me?" Calvin glanced over Lily's head and saw Alara standing near the biography section, her arms wrapped around herself like armor. She looked older. There were fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, but she was still beautiful, still the woman who had changed his life by loving him when he didn't deserve it. Their eyes met across the library, and Calvin saw fear there, but also something else. Hope, maybe, or at least the willingness to try. "I would love to read to you," Calvin told Lily, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "Both of you." Rose, the quieter twin, stepped closer to her sister but kept her distance from Calvin. "Are you really our daddy?" The question was delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that only children possessed, but it hit Calvin like a physical blow. He looked to Alara for guidance. She approached slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. "Girls, this is Calvin. Remember how we talked about him? The daddy who went away but wants to come back?" Lily asked, tilting her head in a gesture so reminiscent of Alara that Calvin had to steady himself against a bookshelf. "Something like that," Alara said softly. Calvin knelt down to the girl's eye level, his heart hammering against his ribs. Up close he could see even more of himself in their faces, the shape of their eyebrows, the stubborn set of their chins when they were thinking hard about something. "I made some very big mistakes," Calvin said carefully, using the same gentle tone he'd perfected with the children at the center. "I hurt your mama, and I missed out on watching you grow up. I'm very sorry about that." Rose studied him with the serious intensity of a child trying to solve a complicated puzzle. "Mama cries sometimes when she looks at pictures." "Rose," Alara warned gently. "It's okay," Calvin said, though each word felt like swallowing glass. "She has every right to be sad. What I did was wrong." "But you read stories to kids now," Lily announced, apparently having absorbed enough of their previous conversations to piece together this fact. "Mama showed us pictures on the computer." Calvin's eyes flicked to Alara in surprise. She'd been researching him, watching his volunteer work from afar. "I do," Calvin confirmed. "I learned that taking care of children is the most important job in the world. I wanted to practice so I could be better at it." "Are you better at it now?" Rose asked. Calvin considered the question seriously. I think I am. But that's not really for me to decide. Other people have to decide if I've gotten better. I think you're better, Lily declared with the confident authority of a 3.5-year-old. You have kind eyes. Mama says people with kind eyes are usually good people. Over the girls' heads, Calvin met Ilara's gaze again. She was crying, silent tears that she wiped away quickly so the girls wouldn't see. Would you like to hear the story now? Calvin asked. For the next 30 minutes, Calvin read Corduroy to his daughters, while other library patrons gathered around the story circle. Lily curled up against his left side halfway through, her small body warm and trusting. Rose remained at a careful distance, but Calvin caught her smiling at the funny voices he did for the characters. When the story ended, Ilara approached their small group. Girls, why don't you go pick out some books while Mama talks to Calvin? The twins scampered off toward the picture book section, their voices carrying back in excited whispers about their daddy who reads stories. Ilara sat down across from Calvin, her hands folded in her lap in the same gesture he remembered from 5 years ago. You stopped looking for us, she said without preamble. I realized I was doing it wrong, Calvin replied. I was trying to find you instead of becoming someone worth finding. Jessica told me about the therapy, the volunteering, that you took a leave from your company. Calvin nodded. I needed to figure out who I was without all the things I thought defined me. Turns out I didn't like the answer very much. And now? Calvin watched his daughters through the book stacks, saw the way they helped each other reach books on higher shelves, the way they shared everything naturally. They were good kids, kind kids. Ilara had raised them beautifully, completely on her own. Now I know that being their father isn't a right I was born with, Calvin said quietly. It's something I have to earn every single day, if you'll let me try. Ilara was quiet for a long moment. They ask about you, more and more lately. Lily wants to know why her daddy doesn't live with us like Sarah's daddy lives with Sarah. What do you tell them? That some daddies need more time to learn how to be good daddies. That love isn't always enough. Sometimes people have to change and grow before they can be together. Calvin felt tears threaten for the first time in months. Do you think I've changed enough? Grown enough? Ilara studied his face with the same intensity Rose had shown earlier. I think you're trying. Really trying. Not just pretending for my benefit. And I think maybe it's time to let you try with them too. The words hit Calvin like a sunrise after the longest night of his life. What does that look like? He asked carefully. Slowly, Ilara said. Very slowly. Maybe Saturday visits here in Madison at first. Phone calls, video chats. If the girls are comfortable, if you prove you're reliable, maybe weekend visits in Chicago eventually. And us? Calvin asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, I have no right to ask that. But Ilara surprised him. I don't know yet, she said honestly. The woman who loved you 5 years ago trusted you completely and had her heart broken. The woman sitting here now is more careful, smarter, but maybe she's also ready to believe that people can really change if they want it badly enough. Mama, Calvin, Lily's voice carried across the library. Come see the book about butterflies. Calvin looked at Ilara, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and together they walked toward their daughters, who were already building a stack of books to take home. As Calvin knelt down to admire Rose's selection of books about castles and Lily's collection of stories about animals, he felt something he'd never experienced before. Not the desperate, controlling love he'd once mistaken for the real thing, but something quieter and more profound. Peace, purpose, the bone-deep knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what mattered most. Calvin? Rose's small voice interrupted his thoughts. Will you come read to us again next week? Calvin looked up at Ilara, who nodded almost imperceptibly. If your mama says it's okay, I would love to come read to you next week, Calvin said. And the week after that? Lily asked hopefully. Calvin's throat tightened with emotion. For as long as you want me to. Rose considered this seriously, then made a decision that would change all their lives. Okay, she said simply. But next time, can you bring the book about the daddy bear who learns to take care of his cubs? Calvin laughed, surprising himself with the sound of pure joy. I'll bring that book, I promise. As they walked toward the checkout desk, Lily's small hand slipping trustingly into his, Calvin realized that some stories don't end with dramatic declarations of love or passionate reunions. The best stories, the ones worth waiting for, end with the quiet promise of tomorrow and the day after that, and all the days that follow. They end with the simple, revolutionary act of showing up. And Calvin Monroe had finally learned how to stay. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding your way back to someone. They're about becoming worthy of being found. Calvin spent 2 years learning that real love isn't about possession or control. It's about sacrifice, growth, and the patience to earn what you once threw away. What would you have done in Calvin's position? Would you have had the courage to change completely for love, even without any guarantee it would be enough? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.